Good evening, everybody.
Welcome to the Mississauga Library, the Hazel McCalligan Central Library here. My name is Lucy, and I'm your moderator and host this evening. Tonight, our program is Pseudomedical Psychedelia, Examining the Rhetoric of Nootropic Supplements, with Professor Kate Madalena from the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology at University of Toronto at Mississauga. This talk will describe a trend in psychotropic substances like psilocybin, ketamine, and amphetamines, all of which are touted as nootropic drugs on social media and in marketing materials. We'll specifically learn about two examples of gender framings of such substances, one in homeopathic grind culture and the other in the mommy blogger world. We always begin with the land acknowledgement, which I'll read. We acknowledge the lands which constitute the present-day city of Mississauga as being part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and Wyandot Nations. We recognize these peoples and their ancestors as people who inhabited these lands since time immemorial. The city of Mississauga is home to many global Indigenous peoples. As a municipality, the city of Mississauga is actively working towards reconciliation by confronting our past and our present, providing space for Indigenous peoples within their territory to recognize and uphold their treaty rights and to support Indigenous peoples. We formally recognize the Anishinaabe origins of our name and continue to make Mississauga a safe space for all Indigenous peoples. And now a few plugs for the library. Actually, let's do some technical details first. This is a hybrid lecture, so you can see that it's being presented on as a webinar as well as a virtual webinar. The people who are watching on the webinar cannot see the audience or hear the audience. They only see what's up here. So when we do the Q&A later on, Professor or I will repeat your questions so those people can hear it. And I'll be monitoring the chat line for questions from the virtual audience, and I'll be stating them out loud so you can hear what they're asking. So bear with us. A hybrid lecture is a little complex that way, but we want everyone to get their questions in. Next, we want to talk about Mississauga Library e-resources. I hope you all have a library card. Our 24/7 digital services are available for free with your library card, and most of those resources are also available from home. We have ebooks, magazines, newspapers, movies, music, and many specialized e-resources like Mango Languages, like LinkedIn Resources, LinkedIn Learning. Please visit the website for details or call us. We also have newsletters. Sign up for the newsletters and find out about our other programs. In the new year, the next lecture me will be on February 4th, and it is Poetry is Not a Luxury, Resources for Survival in Black Women's Writing, with Professor Anna Thomas from the Department of English and Drama at UTM. In this talk, Professor Thomas will explore how women writers have turned to poetry to navigate both chronic and critical difficulties in their lives. With a particular focus on Audre Lorde, whose essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, inspires the title of this talk, Professor Thomas will share how poetry enables the exploration of the self and the other, the individual and society, and between feeling and reason. Learn how close reading, a methodology for critically engaging text central to literary studies, can attune us to ever-expanding meaning, can reward rereading, and can help us navigate our own everyday conditions of life. I'll be back after the Q&A, but now I'm going to give the mic over to James Malinowski, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Lucy. Good evening, everyone. In collaboration with the Mississauga Library System, we thank you for attending tonight's third Lecture Me Talk of the 2024-25 season. My name is James Malinowski, and I'm the Community Engagement Officer in the Experiential Education Unit within the Office of a Vice Principal, Academic and Dean at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Kate Madalena from the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology, who will be delivering her talk entitled Pseudomedical Psychedelia, Examining the Rhetoric of Nootropic Supplements. Professor Madalena studies knowledge-making media, epistemic rhetoric, and the popular uptake of science and medicine. She teaches writing and critical theory-informed media studies at the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology. She writes about stuff like Lego bricks, genetics, drugs, microbiota, and ghosts. Her forthcoming book with Jeremy Tyrrell is tentatively titled Disgustatory, A Gothic Rhetoric of Consumption. Over to you, Professor Madalena.
Thanks so much. I'd really like, I don't have to introduce myself now. Like I was at first, I introduced myself. I'm Kate. And yeah, that's me. I study knowledge-making media, and I teach writing and science communication. And one thing that's missing from that bio, and that's my fault, is I study public communication of science and health. So I'm really interested in the way the media, either media as like these things that we use to make knowledge, shapes that knowledge, and then also how media, as in mass media, communicate that knowledge. And the fact that science is constantly making and revising knowledge, like knowledge is a process, this gets really complicated, as I'm sure you know, especially after the last 5 years. So that's what I study and what I'm fascinated by. And I teach science writing, so I try to teach communicators to do that work better, and to criticize work that's being done and to do that work critically. I want to be sure to thank all of you for being here to listen to me, you on the webinar, on the web, and also you who are present. Thanks so much for spending this time with me. And to thank UTM and its experiential education unit. Thanks so much. Thank you, James, for setting me up here and for having me. And thank you, Elizabeth, who's back there, and Lucy, thanks so much for having me here. Thank you, Mississauga Public Library. It's also helping, I should confess that it's doing this talk tonight and spending time with you is helping to distract me from something else that's going on at exactly the same time. First mention, but it won't be the last mention because it's actually kind of uncanny that I'm giving this talk tonight because there's a lot of, it pertains, it's pertinent. So, yeah, thanks for that. I'm from North Carolina originally. My PhD is from, so in 20 minutes, the polls close down there. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is one chapter from a book that I've written with my friend and colleague Jeremy Tyrrell. And I wanted to, before I jump into it, I'll give you an agenda and everything, is to stop at this page and just ask, because I'm a prof, I have to do this, like I have to immediately invite participation. Ask if any of you are familiar with this term rhetoric. Like when you think of it, have you heard it before? And when I've seen people nod, so you have heard of it before. Did you study it in school? Some of you, yes, some of you, no. When you think of it, what do you think of? And don't worry, I'm not going to give a pop quiz or anything, but just like things that you think of when you hear the word rhetoric, like what? Yes.
Politicians.
Politicians, absolutely. Others?
Philosophy 101.
It gets studied in philosophy, right? So like Aristotle is where it starts. And when you think of rhetoric, or when I think of rhetoric, or if I'm trying to define rhetoric for a intellectually diverse audience, like I don't know what your interests are, I think about talking about Aristotle, and he separated rhetoric from poetics, right? So it's all the language that's not beautiful. Poetry is beauty, is mythos, is storytelling, all this. Rhetoric is language that is pragmatic and technical, and it's also what convinces. So the art of rhetoric, according to Aristotle, and don't worry, we don't stop at Aristotle. I have some problems with Aristotle, actually. But rhetoric, according to Aristotle, and continuing to be according to us, is language used to convince. If I want to convince arguments, like I want to make an argument, I want to back that argument up with claims, or I make a claim, I back that argument up with proof. The proof behind those, the stuff that I prove my claims with has warrants, like it, and we have to have a shared ground. That could go on and on, right? I could give you a whole lecture on rhetoric, but just, it's not poetic, it's argumentation, it's convincing. And it's absolutely linked with politicians, because the first modern rhetoricians studied political speech, speech of folks who are trying to convince people to vote for them and for policy. So tonight, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this book that I've written with a co-author, because what I'm speaking about, the nootropics bit, is only a chapter in a book. So this is a piece of a larger project. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what nootropics are, or what the discourse around nootropics are. Are any of you familiar, like you've heard that term before? Okay, a few folks. And then what I'm doing with nootropics is actually a rhetorical thing, so this is a little bit confusing. Nootropics are a thing, and it's the turning of mind. That means, trope means to turn. And then tropes in rhetoric are literally terms in an argument. And I'm going to talk about two different tropes that we see in discourse about nootropics. They're actually two tropes towards genders. So we're going to do a little gender studies here tonight too, and that's another moment where I have to do like quick gender studies 101. And then we'll talk about some implications. And that, like I said before, has a little bit to do with tonight's, what's happening south of us tonight. So the book the larger context for the chapter that I'm talking about tonight is called Disgustatory, a Gothic rhetoric of consumption. And it is about weird stuff that we eat and don't eat and consume for our health these days because of wellness discourses. And if you wonder what I mean by that, if you eat yogurt every morning like I do, because you've been convinced that that helps your gut microbiome to keep you healthy, then you are in our book. Like, we are in our book too. So it's people making choices to consume for their health stuff that isn't necessarily prescribed by their doctor. And I could go on and on, but it's called disgustatory because it can get a little gross. But we think very interesting. And this has been a really fun book to write. And my co-author, I should mention one more time, is at UNCW. His name is Jeremy Terrell. This is not my co-author, Jeremy Terrell. This is Bela Lugosi's famous portrayal of Dracula, and I put him to represent the fact that our book also posits a rhetorical Gothic that permeates this discourse about what we should do about our health in current times, and I'll try to bring that more out. But we borrow from a rich scholarship of Gothic and literary studies, and the rhetorical Gothic, we argue, functions as a mythos and also as an ethos, and it's a way that we, in talking about these things, manifest anxieties about our bodies, especially because our bodies are more and more involved in machines and in systems that quantify us and turn us into objects. That's a very quick explanation of what we mean by the rhetorical Gothic. So the rhetorical Gothic induces individuals toward a contradictory desire to assert exceptionalist control over their own health, that is, outside of the system. We want a solution outside of the system by romancing destruction. That's part of the disgustatory part. So it's fitting that I'm giving this talk at the tail end of spooky season. It's kind of perfectly aligned with both Halloween, but it's also uncannily fitting that I'm giving this talk while the polls are closing in the East Coast of the U.S., and we're facing the possibility of another Trump presidency in the U.S., because we actually frame the book with the question of how we frame the book on both ends, in the introduction and the conclusion, with the case of ivermectin and how people in the United States and more beyond the United States became convinced to consume a horse dewormer to try to cure themselves of COVID in 2020. So we were kind of, as people who study health communication, we were floored by this fact, right? And I'd like to pause and actually give you a little excerpt from our introduction. It's fitting right now. So we start with a quote from then President Donald Trump. And he says, "I'll say it again, what do you have to lose? Take it," said U.S. President Donald Trump on April 4th, 2020 during a press briefing by the Federal Coronavirus Task Force. His remarks addressed hydroxychloroquine, an anti-malarial that in medical studies had demonstrated no definitive ability to treat or prevent the COVID-19 disease caused by the SARS-CoV-2 novel coronavirus. Yet the president boasted that the Strategic National Stockpile had secured 29 million doses of it. In the teeth of the global pandemic, the president repeatedly asserted that it was each individual's prerogative and responsibility to determine if they should ingest a pharmaceutical with known significant adverse effects in uncertain hope of combating a debilitating and deadly virus. The stakes were clear, although the outcomes were opaque. Try it if you'd like, stated the television personality and former state pitchman turned president. He later claimed to have personally taken the drug prophylactically during May 2020, along with vitamin D and zinc, which are two over-the-counter supplements, with similarly inconclusive evidence of effect on COVID-19 at the time. And I should take a minute to say that sales of hydroxychloroquine exploded following the president's vocal advocacy. Afterward, multiple news articles explicitly labeled President Trump a snake oil salesman for fomenting this fervor. The dean of the Brown University School of Public Health pointed out in his New York Times opinion piece that the snake oil salesman of the Senate, that months after multiple clinical trials found no evidence that hydroxychloroquine improves COVID-19 outcomes, and some evidence that it worsens them, Congress was still holding hearings that touted its efficacy. A New York family blamed the drug for a woman's unexpected death. A man died after ingesting chloroquine phosphate, a different chemical formulation with a similar name, commonly used to clean fish tanks. His wife, also sickened by the substance, stated that Trump kept saying it was basically pretty much a cure, she added. We were afraid of getting sick. So we frame this book with this question, like, how is this possible that we as a population are able to be convinced to do something like that? And I say very pointedly we, because although this book, when I'm talking to people about the book, like in an elevator, my elevator pitch, I say that it's a book about contemporary snake oil. But I want to be really careful to say that myself and my co-author and the book, it's not a book about snake oil, like, oh, you're so stupid to do this. It's about stuff that, so the original snake oil was actually an oil from one specific snake in Asia that probably did have some effects as a liniment. And then it got taken, or it got co-opted in the West, when trains went west in the United States, and different kinds of oils were sold as it, right? So much of what we talk about in this book we're not saying that they are necessarily, in some cases, they're not at all scientifically wrong even, but they are just as of yet untested, and people are making all kinds of decisions about them, their own wellness with them. Okay. One thing that I don't think that public talks do enough is to give a good nod to the work that my own work or our own work stands on. And so I just wanted to include a slide of some of my citations. So a whole bunch of people are researching the way we eat. So we cite literature on food studies, cultural studies, media studies, and science and technology studies. And I especially want to give a shout out to this scholar here, Colleen Durkat, who is at TMU. She's my colleague at TMU, and she's my friend now because I've talked to her so much about this. And our book depends a whole lot on her book. which is called My Wellness Self. So our book talks about this. It's seven chapters, an introduction and conclusion are two of the chapters, and then the 5 chapters in the middle are case studies. And those case studies are about meal replacements. So if you see Soylent over there, the Soylent meal replacement, lab-grown meats, probiotics, and to be really careful, also, I just said snake oil, and there's a chapter on probiotics. Probiotics are not necessarily like snake oil. They're doing real amazing things with infections like C. diff. So if you want to talk about probiotics and Q&A, I would love to do that. Extreme diets, and that's the Body Beast one here, extreme diets. And then the last one here, the Crash plus Reboot, is representing this one that I'm going to talk about today, ostensibly mind-maximizing drugs in the very flexible supplement category of nootropics. So each of the chapters approaches a different topic and also a different, I'll call it data set, but we don't treat it as data because we're rhetoricians. So we read a lot of stuff. We make a corpus of writing and speech, basically. So it analyzes different corpuses. Lab-grown meats is about, for example, Reddit. We scraped Reddit. And mine is mostly actually a little bit of Reddit, but mostly actually the advertising materials, and then some Vice News articles, so news media on nootropics. And these chapters also represent the aspects of what we came to define as the rhetorical Gothic, and those aspects are quantification. So if it's Gothic, it has all these things. If it's this creepy, weird rhetoric that we're calling Gothic rhetoric, it has quantification, it has some aspect of hybridity, it concentrates on regulation or rules, like there are rules around it, and you can imagine the special diets represents that one. Abjection or infection, so the word abjection means that it has to do with the body and the bodily processes. And then the one that this chapter talks about is optimization, trying to optimize our bodies and minds. So that's our framework of the rhetorical Gothic. And I'm turning now to the chapter that I want to talk about tonight, the chapter about nootropics. And what nootropics are a market-defined category of supplement that now includes almost anything that enhances cognition. And in wellness marketing discourse, it can refer to pharmaceuticals like Pervitin, modafinil, and Benzedrine, as well as caffeine and psilocybin. So probably most of us here consume, how many of you consume caffeine? Raising my hand high, consuming it now. Most of us here probably consume some of these substances. But they are in this broad umbrella that the market defines as nootropics. And all that means, I mean, it's not all that means. There's a whole lot of defining discourse about it, but it means stuff that you ingest that makes your mind work better. How many of you need caffeine for your mind to work at normal functioning level? Right. So, and the original definition of nootropic was that it wouldn't be addictive, that it actually didn't do any damage. And funny thing about science, the jury's still out about caffeine. I'm clinging to the claim that caffeine is good for you because I have some in the morning, right? It's defined as anything that maximizes or improves your cognitive function without doing damage to your brain. So this also, the umbrella, there are two interesting questions. As we wrote this book, there came to be so many other interesting sub-questions than just the question, how do people get convinced to consume weird stuff by wellness discourses. And two of the questions that this chapter brought up is, how is there a kind of substance that is marketed and that the umbrella of its definition includes LSD and methamphetamine? Like, it's kind of incredible, because or for me it is, because LSD we associate with, or I associate with, a cultural way of being and a way of life, and also a history that is super, super different, although, spoiler alert, it isn't, it's similar in some really interesting ways, to what methamphetamines are for, right? And I'm being vague, but like, LSD is hippies and chilling and spiritual and tripping, and methamphetamines are ants and producing and super soldiers and stuff like that, right? So that question comes up. And then the other question that comes up, and I will refer back to my colleague whose book I showed, Colleen Derkatch, she asked this question too. We're seeing the increased medicalization of these substances as well. So there's, in these discourses that we're studying, we notice that almost always the discussion is couched in some kind of therapeutic, medicalized way, instead of what 20 years ago might have been discussed as recreational drugs. It's a kind of strange laundering that's happening there, discursive laundering happening there. Checking my time, and I'm going too slow. So this chapter specifically uses the example of these nootropics, and I'm using those two seemingly very different substances, the methamphetamine and magic mushrooms, which contain psilocybin, under the same roof. It's describing how two seemingly oppositional tropes or turns, and my goofy little purple arrow here is symbolizing the trope, turns away from each other, differences, can occupy the same rhetorical space. And we actually call this, rhetoricians call this a tropology. And it exists inside a topology of space too. So like in the same rhetorical space, two different terms can coexist. A topology describes the landscape, and our tropology describes turns within that landscape. And so part of the point of this chapter's critique is that the kinds of drugs that fueled Nazi super soldiers in World War II occupies the same rhetorical space as magic mushrooms, a medicine appropriated by the West, and first for recreational for spirituality, then for recreation, and now a new recent turn for psychedelic therapy. Although it's a recent turn back to some 60s psychedelic therapy. The original research in psychedelics was also for therapeutics. The tropes in this case are a dialectical and highly problematic set of subjectivities. We posit a Gothic masculine and an eco-feminist Gothic. And here's where we do our quick gender studies lesson. So what we're talking about when we talk about a Gothic masculine is the cyborg soldier beast. And when we're talking about a Gothic feminine, we're talking about the shaman hippie witch. And they share rhetorical space via nootropic consumption and experimentation. And we argue that these terms are produced both by the substance itself. So the drugs they have effects on the body, and the mythos and epistemologies and ethos produced by market-driven discourse networks around the substance. So I want to be careful to say that this discussion of the Gothic masculine and a Gothic ecofeminism take up gender as informed by Judith Butler and Halberstam and others, Jack Halberstam and others. So when we're talking about Gothic masculinities and Gothic feminisms as separate rhetorical terms in a shared rhetorical space, we don't mean to reify a gender binary. Rather, we mean to describe markedly gendered tendencies in a particular space of the rhetorical Gothic. So the gendered tropes don't remain distinct. They're a rhetorical framing of the subjectivity. And I think you'll see what I mean. That's too vague. You'll see what I mean when I get into some of the analysis, when I show you some of this analysis. One of the three corpora we analyze in this chapter is 34 articles in the Vice News archives, which is a very masculine topology, right? So Vice media is a masculine space. It is. And they're marked, these are articles marked with the keyword nootropic. And one of our findings is that these tropes articulate a politics that doesn't map cleanly onto electoral politics, or even identity politics in the US and Canada. So it gets really messy. So a little bit of history about these substances. The rhetorical turn to the feminine is a story of surprise, surprise, cultural appropriation and colonial violence with a cameo by the CIA. The story starts with Maria Sabina, popularly and problematically called the mother of the psychedelic movement. She was a Mazatec healer. Sabina helped this guy, a PR guy for JP Morgan turned anthropologist, calls himself that, an amateur mycologist, trip on mushrooms for the first time. And he published a really famous photo essay that's often cited as the beginning of the psychedelic therapy movement in North America. He went on to be a CIA asset and a semi-famous figure on the psychedelic scene. The psychedelic story starts in the field, a space rendered territory for colonial extraction by the apparatus of the sciences, in this case, anthropology, and it wasn't even really anthropology, it was charlatan anthropology. And then the mother of the spiritual or psychological psychedelic search in the West is Maria Sabina, and she passed away relatively unknown and in poverty. And there's so much more to say about that, but I'll stop there for now. And fast forward almost 70 years, and therapeutic psychedelics are having a renaissance with online services like this one. Field trips, the healing ecofeminist trope remains the same, but the substance has changed. And at this point, this is like in 2020, psilocybin isn't broadly legal. It still isn't, but it's broadly available. That's a change that's happened in Canada during the writing of this book that's been really, really interesting. So I immediately started texting my co-author like pictures of magic mushroom stores on the streets of Toronto while this book was being written. The drug being used here, though, is ketamine, a famous party drug and horse tranquilizer. These companies offer a personalized menu of services, including online guidance for therapy sessions at home. So it's kind of your own personal shaman, but via the internet. I'll talk about this more when I share some of my analysis of the moms on mushrooms, which is what this chapter analyzes. And then the other turn towards agothic masculinity, nootropics claims a founding father, Corneliu Gheorghiu, a chemist who coined the term and dedicated his career to finding a class of chemical cognitive enhancers that would fit certain criteria. And the first of these was piracetam, which is pictured here. And then examples of contemporary Gothic masculine subjectivity that come from nootropics in wellness discourse include Joe Rogan, the libertarian podcaster, Dr. Jeffrey Life, the impossibly buff 69-year-old doctor in the In-Flight magazine who promises to defy death with enhanced cognitive and physical function well past 70. Do you guys remember this guy from the In-Flight magazine? Did you ever see him? No, okay, that's him. David Asprey, the biotech entrepreneur who made Bullet Coffee, and others. What about Bullet Coffee? Do you remember Bullet Coffee? Coffee with butter in it. Yeah. that made your stomach, like it eased your stomach a little and gave you some fat, but it was also the secret to like long life and health. So these are like what other writers call bromeopathy, like the masculine beasting, like the optimization and maximization of both the mind and often the body. What we analyzed for the bromeopathy for the masculine turn is a corpus from Vice News, and then what we analyzed from the feminine side, the Gothic feminine side, is Moms on Mushrooms. And I want to see, good. This service is a different thing. So Vice Media is a masculine space. It's a alternative news source started by Gavin Newsom in the 1990s to cover alternative things like alternative music and health, but became a very masculine space. And that was our corpus for the nootropics, because they covered nootropics starting very early when nootropics started to become a trend. And then Moms on Mushrooms was our case study for the Gothic feminine, and what they do, they are a collective in the Western United States, in Colorado, who sell the expertise of some spiritual guides to guide mothers through magic mushroom trips on the web. So you sign up for a course and you stay home and you microdose on mushrooms, and your guide helps you through that process. So you attend classes. But the key thing is with Moms on Mushrooms is that you don't need to leave the home to do this. So you can still be a mom and a homemaker and do everything you need to do. You can have it all, and you can improve yourself. You can awaken your spirit. You can become a deeper person and feel fulfilled, and maybe cure depression, et cetera, through this microdosing process. It's really interesting. So I want to take a minute to read a little bit from the chapter with our Vice Media analysis, and then read a little bit from the Moms on Mushrooms also. And then I will stop shouting at you and ask you for questions. I feel like I'm shouting often when I lecture because I talk loudly. So Vice Media, and I'm not reading all of it. I'm just going to read a few paragraphs. From 2015 on, some of Vice's coverage of the nootropic community continues in a critical vein. So they're actually critiquing some of the effects of some of these drugs, while other articles focus on how to use these substances to hack cognitive function. The critical articles are often categorized in the health section, and the user guide articles are categorized in the tech section. So if it's talking about if it's going to be problematic for your health, it's categorized as health. But if it's talking about something that's going to help you out, it's categorized as technology, which is actually pretty rhetorically interesting when you think about it. An article by Spencer Davis titled Your Friendly Guide to Nootropics profiles a YouTube newt guru, they call them newts, Steve Cronin, who documents his experiments with diet and smart drugs to counteract the lasting effects of a Lyme disease infection. And footnote, a ton of folks are in these communities and in this discourse to solve health problems that mainstream medicine isn't helping them solve. So a big theme in this book is that folks are taking these exceptional pathways because they're not finding the help that they need with mainstream doctors. And some of them don't even have a mainstream doctor. 40 years ago, you might have had a family doctor that you had since you were young, and these days that is not the case. So people are trying to solve that problem. The article is filed under tech and frames the nootropic community as what Cronin calls crowd science, or a very prolific online community that's making knowledge faster and with more practical implications than the mainstream community is. The retired NFL star Bill Romanowski similarly claims that he designed his own newt cocktail to treat the brain fog that resulted from multiple concussions on the gridiron. In the category of health, Sebastian Serrano pens a first-person narrative about his own experimentation with modafinil called "Taking the Smart Drug Modafinil Made Me Love Work But Hate People." Serrano's reflection is ultimately a critique of capital markets and the kinds of drugs they drive us to desire. In the rat race that is modern life, it's sort of the only drug that makes sense, Serrano writes. How awful is that? Serrano goes so far as to ask whether performance-enhancing drugs at work could cause an unlevel playing field and or increase expectations for productivity for workers who are not using them. The promise of productivity hints at another theme among the Vice stories about nootropics, the get-rich story. And I won't read that whole article or that whole paragraph, but a lot of these folks are using these drugs to grind to get ahead, to make money, and in some cases, selling these drugs as their money-making scheme. So that's a little sample of the analysis of Vice news. And then a little sample of the story about the ecofeminism, moms on mushrooms. So an access to experts is the main product being sold. The site carefully constructs the ethos of its facilitators with a combination of humility, spirituality, and institutionally credentialed expertise. The two facilitators, who are not the main owner, take very different approaches to this ethos. The first connects expertise with personal experience and spiritual language. And I'll give you a little sample of that to see what I'm talking about. She says, I weave a sacred facilitator approach to my mom's circles, connecting you back to yourself through prayer, herbology, grounding, nature, and of course, plant medicine. My own journey through reproductive health issues provides me with a unique and very deep level of compassion for mothers and allows me to hold a space for health, birth, and womb trauma while also offering practical tips for you, a likely overwhelmed and busy mom, to simply feel better in your body. The other facilitator, a different facilitator, establishes herself firmly in an institutional ethos by invoking her many scholarly and clinical credentials, including her status as a certified counselor. She lists, my microdosing practice is enhanced by my BS in health ed, therapeutic certification through Salt City Psychedelic Therapy and Research, mycology, psychology, holonic practitioner certification, as well as my postgraduate certificate in applied positive psychology from the University of Utah. So these two very different constructions might be flagged as conflicting in a different kind of space, but the mom platform, like Goop, are you guys familiar with Goop? I talk about Goop elsewhere in this chapter. And the other companies in this speculative space frames itself as a hybrid that's radically different from more traditional institutions. The director's profile includes a kind of editor's letter manifesto, and she says she's not a guru, influencer, life coach, or healer. Rather, she considers herself to be a lifelong student of spirituality, plant medicine, and health. This links back to Wasson, the guy who took mushrooms from Maria Sabina. It kind of harkens back to him being a self-made ethnomycologist, like he's not actually an anthropologist, but he calls himself one. And she frames her power in the Judeo-Christian value of service and evokes God multiple times in her text. She writes, I come to you as a humble teacher and guide who finds immense joy in being of service to moms. And she goes on about how she wants to reconnect mothers with her passion. But then things get weird. She starts talking about the mushrooms themselves and uses a fungal metaphor to create the image of a cosmic network that's speaking to her. The mycelial network has really gotten into my heart, she writes, telling me to reach out to moms. And our Gothic lens tints this image dark and sees her overgrown by fungus merging into a wall like a victim of the upside down in Stranger Things or one of the infected in The Last of Us. She goes on to call the mushroom's voice the source and connects it to what she calls a new form of feminine divinity. And this is a quote from her. With all the respect I can give, I'm accepting its guidance to use its healing powers as the basis of this new work with mothers. The old ways, paradigms, and ideas that have become the norm in our society are breaking apart, and there's a growing presence of the divine feminine force that needs us to build up a better and more lasting way of living. Her old ways are not, one would assume, some ancient mystical practice, but the mundane practices of post-industrial, post-colonial modernity. The text isn't terribly clear about that, but whatever the old ways are, she's claiming that they're giving way to a new earth. And she sees, I won't read this whole quote, but she sees moms at the forefront of creating and developing this new earth. Moms taking care of their, control of their own destiny and their right to be happy. And they're taking some mushrooms to realize this. The mushrooms, it would seem, are telling her to escape the patriarchy, and she's listening to them, and she'll teach you how to listen to for just $1,100 for her course. T's language of escape to another place, a new way, far away, is crucially interesting to a rhetorical analysis attuned to space. The MOM platform offers escape in two ways, both of which do not require the subscriber to move an inch from their physical space. First, microdosing itself is offered as an escape. Ironically, the trip, a metaphor of travel, is for mom a means by which to be more present as a mother. So the microdosing trip is a way to travel without leaving, to escape, to be present, a contradictory metaphysics for mothers on the new earth. And then secondly, the online course is another escape without escaping. One can attend a course online without leaving the house. The mom community, like all online communities, is not a physically co-present one. The mom on mushrooms, then, is Derrida's absent presence, a ghost of hauntology. She's the mother locked in the attic. And she's also, she can have her cake and eat it too, although it's not a very tasty cake. She's able to continue to do her work and be a productive mother subject while still taking care of herself by microdosing a mushroom. And I'll read this last little bit because it says that better. The site's focus on personal transformation for individual microdosing mothers elides a requirement for any kind of collective transformation. There's nothing here to scare off subscribers or investors. An absence of politics makes the platform perfectly marketable to any kind of voter, linkable to any mass media vehicle without compromising the stances there. Mom is the perfect media object, wife and mother. It exists without taking up space. So those are little samples of the analysis, and I'm getting to the end of my time to talk. But one thing that we find about the politics, and that last little paragraph turns to the thing I'm trying not to think about tonight, the politics. In these spaces, in both of these spaces, a neoliberal exceptionalism meets, among other things, neoconservative hypernationalism. For one example, as I was finishing the current draft of this chapter, I had to scramble to incorporate recent revelations of rich and insidious QAnon groups in wellness circles, specifically yoga studios. And there's a historian, Kathleen Beaulieu at Yale, who has new work on what she's calling the crunchy to alt-right pipeline. So this, I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but in a wellness space, it's absolutely not possible that that you know the politics of the space when you enter it. It's a very interesting and messy situation. And one of the upshots of this chapter and the whole book actually is that wellness has always been and remains a space in which markets reproduce the political in new and confusing and sometimes terrifying ways. So this is I tried to stay away from words on my slides, but I knew that I would be getting to the end, and I know how I talk, and I talk too much, and then I don't have enough time at the end. So some implications for the book, the whole book, but also this chapter of the book. For rhetoric, for the study of rhetoric, which is my field, which you guys might not care about as much, there are some academic stakes. So rhetoric concentrates on argument and making arguments like I have a stance, like a political stance, and I'm going to convince you of my stance. And we're finding that these rhetorics don't rely on a stance at all. Actually, they are pretty vague about stance, and they rely more on a trope or a turning. It's actually kind of a more literary way of convincing. So for rhetoric, this calls us to consider the fact that those kinds of convincings happen. Like everything that you think or believe you haven't been argued into it. There's all kinds of ways that convincing works that isn't stance-taking argumentation. Also, my identity, so this is about the drugs themselves. My identity is produced in my body as well as with my words and with my belief systems. So if I were to take some methamphetamines before coming to give this talk, my identity would play out differently in front of you, I promise. So the production of identities is linked to the production and reproduction of bodies. One big takeaway here, and I hope you saw this in both of my examples, in the gendered masculine, hyper-masculine grind culture that the upper nootropics produce, they are producing, they're changing their bodies and their identity to make them able to work in the grind and be productive for capital. And the same thing with the moms on mushrooms. They're trying to figure out a way to tap into their eco-feminist identity without interrupting their role as productive mother. And both of these things, from a Marxist lens, smooth the way for capital, the forces of capital and capital circuits. And this is getting also political. These are choices that are exceptionalist. So I'm choosing something, or I'm deciding on a regime for myself that's special to me because I know something that the person sitting next to me doesn't. The person sitting next to me might not have access to this. It's special, it's exceptional. And that's an ethos and an orientation that is counter to a socialist one. It isn't something for all. It plugs into an exceptionalist politics. And these are constantly being reproduced. So in these wellness spaces, these are reproducing all of the above in popular rhetoric. So that's my talk. I get academic at the end. Thanks so much for listening to me. This is me, and this is where you find me. And I'm also, the book is forthcoming in the spring of 2025, and I'd love to talk about it with you more.
And this is our opportunity to chat more. Does anyone have any questions? Right here.
What was liniment?
A liniment. It was to rub on sore muscles, like something that you would, like...
Vaseline.
Well, Vaseline, is it a liniment?
Okay, 535?
I think they...
The stuff that smells real bad?
Yeah, Voltaren.
Ointment.
Yeah, and like sometimes salt, yeah, it's a rub. Yeah.
So like a fight point, you mentioned like a lot of about vocabulary stuff, what a liniment was, so.
Yeah, and it's funny because now I'm wondering what the definition is, but I know it in the realm of horses too. Like there are products you can get that are applied topically to relax muscles.
So just my question, like what do you think is the role of a placebo or a nocebo in helping those who, as you mentioned, may not have, going through the normal channels of treatment, right? So kind of give them some sense of hope. So is that like a bad thing to hold on to? I'm sure you know there's research on placebo actually does have some impact on human healing.
Absolutely.
So where does the really stand on that?
Man, I don't have a good answer to that question, but it's such a good question. So he's asking about, sorry, I forgot to repeat the question. The question is about what I think about placebo or nocebo effects. So the idea that some of these things may, in a double-blind trial, show effects, but they might, we can't tell if they're quote-unquote merely psychological effects or if they're actual, quote-unquote, actual physical effects. And that's such a philosophically fascinating question, And we absolutely do talk about it in the book. So I think probably all of us here, certainly me, I consume things that I think are doing good for my body. And the reason that I consume them is that I think that, but I am not sure of that. And I do think that the fact that I think it is good for me anyway, like the routine of it, the belief in it, et cetera. And any way, Jeremy and I talked about this a whole lot, any way that we choose to think about that, the nocebo effect, it sounds like it's demoting it, and we don't mean to, actually. The comedian Mark Maron does a great piece about this. You laugh, you know him? He talks about turmeric and black pepper. Have you guys heard this at all? Have you heard about turmeric and black pepper? That you're supposed to put them together. And his bit basically is like, yeah, some guy had too much turmeric, and another guy was like, I have too much black pepper. Let's make it the cure for everything, and you have to heat it up and give them a way to do it, and they'll buy it. And then he takes a beat. He's like, and they'll buy it. And then he takes a beat and he goes, so I'm doing it, like I'm eating it. So this idea that we know maybe that they may not be. I eat turmeric. I eat more turmeric now since research started coming out that might improve your cognitive. And I do not necessarily think that turmeric doesn't improve your cognitive, reduce the potential for Alzheimer's and reduce inflammation and all that. But these claims are things that are not studied, like super supported by right now by science. And I'm giving such a long answer because it's such a good question. The probiotic chapter of this book gets into that a lot because as we are writing the book, probiotics, the clinical research in probiotics is catching up to some of the possibly outlandish claims about the benefits of probiotics and proving that some of them aren't so outlandish, right? And one thing that happens here, like one of the first discoveries of probiotic benefit was a study of grandmothers in Bulgaria who made yogurt. And then that study was kind of undercut and proven wrong, like, it was biased in all these ways. And then the current, and this is in the 1970s, the current interest in probiotics has absolutely vindicated the Bulgarian grandmothers, like absolutely, that it's very likely that those folks lived longer because of the yogurt that they made. And probiotic fecal transplant is curing C. diff infections in hospitals that couldn't be cured before. But literally, like as we were starting to write this book, people were doing at-home fecal transplants because they thought it might work, and it did. Like, so that's a really long answer to your very good question.
Giving up our cultural differences, I can't go back into what you use as the axioms for what you're proving. So I'm going to go into a more comedic comment. When you stood next to the screen and you were pointing at it, where a machine projects these thoughts, and you were saying, "This is me." I was a little bit of in a puzzle.
The question or comment is that I pointed to the screen and I said that this is me. What was the picture?
No, that was the same one that you have behind you.
Oh, this is me. Oh, you're saying, okay.
You're referring yourself as in the realm of something completely different.
I am the medium that represents it. Yeah, that is, you're a media studies scholar, obviously. But it's true. Like this is me, and this is the online me, and it's the cyborg me. That's what Donna Haraway would say. Yeah.
I have a very, very long, complicated question, so I'm going to have to read it.
Okay.
I have to find it again.
And then I'll try to summarize it too.
Okay, bear with me on this question. When you mention psychedelics using the allusion to the racialized trope of a magical indigenous shaman helping someone, and how their promotion elides identity politics, I would wonder about the racialized rhetoric of psychedelics. Of course, the demands of productivity because of neoliberalism makes anybody, regardless of race, desiring these psychedelics, creating this lack of stance. I would imagine that different demographics, such as the white contrarian men who listen to Rogan, versus racialized mothers in the ecofeminist group who may mistrust medical practitioners understandably, are persuaded by these rhetorics in different ways. Were there any instances of taking a stance because of medical racism within this wellness discourse of psychedelics?
Whoa. Great question. And I should say, I should be really careful. Okay. Should I repeat my version of the question if I can? So this person is pointing to the racialized history of psychedelics, the psychedelics coming from psilocybin, magic mushrooms coming from the global south, and being appropriated by the global north for its use, which is absolutely an example of historic medical racism. And it's asking if there are any examples from my study about this medical racism. So basically the appropriation of something that erases the racial history. Or, I mean, that's one iteration of, there's all kinds of versions of medical racism. Another version would be to take the benefits of something like this, and that benefit doesn't benefit the community that it came from. And I would say Moms on Mushrooms is an example. Yes, yes. The answer to this question is yes. Moms on Mushrooms, I didn't read the part of the chapter that goes into this. The Moms on Mushrooms group is a group of white women. And they do not, they're white women in Colorado. They're Christian white women. They are very intentionally apolitical, and I think it's exactly, if I were to hypothesize, it's for the exact reason that the commenter questioner is pointing to. It's so that they don't cause trouble for the libertarian stance of their masculine counterpart, which is the Joe Rogan crowd. Just this example. So there are so many other examples. It's so difficult to talk about this. So and I'm not generalizing, I'm just talking about this group. And this group is an example, absolutely, of medical, although they are not a medical group, so it's wellness racism, because they are not the purveyors of the substance. So the user, the person who's enrolled in Moms on Mushrooms, if I'm sitting in my home and I want to sign up for a class, I have to get my own mushrooms. I'm just paying them for access to their website. So I have to get my own mushrooms, and the provenance of those mushrooms has all kinds of political economy that is potentially and definitely oppressing racialized groups. And also it is completely divorced from the tradition in which these mushrooms were originally used, which is, in one case, Maria Sabina's context, the Mazatec context in the global south as medicine. Yeah.
Okay, by the way, this comes from a student at UT. You can't wait to take your class.
Oh, awesome. Yay! Sounds like I need to get out of the way of their thesis. There are so many students at the UT, so I'm just getting out of the way of their thesis because they're so smart.
Okay.
Yeah.
Don't you feel like the idea or the tool of rhetoric is used by, you covered the psychedelic promoting community, but similarly, on the other hand, it's used by the psychiatrists, promoting communities.
Yeah.
The big pharma, if you will. So, and not, they don't really bring forward all the iatrogenic harms over the years that they have caused, right? SSRIs, there's new evidence coming that, they're almost, like not really as helpful as they were initially thought to be. So perhaps, the clergy, and I'm using a rhetorical device, in the scientific community, maybe kind of do some self-reflection as to and understand perhaps why are these people who are educated when it comes to the medical establishment or the non-psychedelic, nootropic, mainstream medicine, right? So both sides use rhetoric, right?
Yes.
during the whole COVID, period, you would have celebrities coming in and endorsing the vaccine, right? That's all rhetoric.
Yep.
Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Hey, I got
Yep.
it, you should get it too, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, it goes both ways, right?
Yes. That's a short answer to that, but absolutely. And I do think, like, the reason for doing this kind of work is exactly what you're talking about, like, to consider the extreme complication and so the extreme care, because the potential for real harm that can be done here. And also, like, so both the nootropic chapter, the diet chapter is a toughie, actually. The amount of harm that happens there clearly is happening there. But the nootropic chapter and the probiotics chapter, both of them, and the diet chapter, those three talk a lot about how folks are desperate to solve problems that aren't being solved by the medical establishment, and also sometimes to reverse harms that have been done to them individually by the medical establishment. And that's a very real experience. And also, yeah, and the way that they are convinced is absolutely also rhetorical, for sure. What was the one more thing I was thinking there? So my co-author and I, Jeremy and I, want to be careful that when we're talking about these folks doing this, we're not trying to make fun of them. The nootropics chapter has a lot of folks. One guy that I read about who was post-Lyme disease and trying to deal with brain fog, and some of these methamphetamines help with brain fog. I drink coffee to help with brain fog, and the regimes that he's putting his body through and sharing with other people are affording him some relief from that. And also, in his case, I don't doubt that they are making knowledge, like they are a knowledge-making community, but they are a knowledge-making community outside of the traditional medical knowledge-making community. So we're trying to be really careful to give respect to that.
My question is about, I'm in the mental health field, and so many of the clients that I work with, they are dealing with addiction and like they are in intoxication. I know that when you search about magic mushroom, one of the things that is helpful is for substance use.
Yep.
But when I'm asked for this from the client, for example, like, is it good that I try? Should I try? It's a very like tricky question
really
for
hard.
me, and my information about it is not enough, honestly. But I want to ask you, like, is it something that it's good, okay? But is it something that they need to be prescribed by the doctor for that to make sure that this is something that they need? For example, like using tools to walk for people who doesn't have legs can be helpful. But when I can walk, when I can practice, do I still need to use those tools because they can just make it easier? And, I know that we don't see it as addictive, but how if it's become addictive later for them, just because of being a comfort zone kind of. So I want to just know if it needs to be prescribed or if people can experiment by themselves or it needs to have guide, and it's recommended for which kind of people, which kind of like mental challenges I call.
Are you asking, like, legally if it's possible to prescribe?
No, not legally.
I am not qualified to tell you whether it needs to be prescribed or not. Like that, I can't tell you that. I can't answer that. But it's absolutely possible. Like, it's possible to get psilocybin without a prescription. And I do not know the answer. Like, I don't. I don't. I'm not qualified to answer that. I have personal opinions, but I'm not going to proselytize them here. Yeah.
Okay, I'm a retired family doctor, and I can't answer that either.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
It's a complicated thing when somebody does come in with emotional problems. To tease out really what the issues are takes a long time.
Yeah.
And sometimes I may not be qualified to do that and have to refer them to a specialist, which is really difficult. it has been difficult
Yep.
in the last few years.
Yes.
So, and I don't know if any psychiatrists are recommending magic mushrooms. I mean, I may be ignorant about this, that's why I came here to listen to you.
Some definitely are. The commenter
absolutely.
said, I don't know if any psychiatrists are recommending magic mushrooms. Some are, yeah. Psychologists and psychiatrists are, yeah.
Do they need to have like a guide to use it, or they can just experiment by themselves?
It depends, are you asking legally, or?
No, just legally, just.
I think it really depends. So, I have not done a study on psychiatric practice or psychological practice, but it really does, right now, it's kind of a wild west as far, and different practitioners, recommend different things. So you can't prescribe psilocybin, you can't prescribe psilocybin right now. That's actually one of the problems, and I'm putting scare quotes around problems, because that opens up a whole other set of questions where this substance that has been used for recreational use for years in the black market is being medicalized now, and so I'm sure that's coming. The legal parameters are on their way for prescribing these kinds of substances, but there are definitely, in this little Wild West area right now, there are definitely psychiatrists and psychologists who are casually recommending experimentation with these substances. And there's plenty, keeping going, there's plenty of clinical research. So if you want to get involved in a study, if I, as a person with depression, I am a person with depression, if I wanted to try to see if psilocybin helped, I can go to St. George and find a study that would do that in a controlled, and possibly, who knows, a controlled environment. It's such a complicated question, yeah.
Because there's also thing like approved by research, and there's some like experience, like alternative medicine or herbal medicine, and remedies that come from generation to generation. And when you look at the things like those ones, 5,000 years and so, very effective. And they still work over years, they don't know, when they use this thing, I'm very pleased and very what's your opinion about that?
So the question, it was a comment and then asking my opinion, but the comment is basically, and tell me if I'm getting it right, there are many medicine traditions that are separate from the Western medical industrial complex that do good for your health. And those practices, as recommended sometimes by practitioners, or also just your practices that you've learned, are good health practices and count as medicine. And then, is that right? And then you're asking my opinion on that. And I absolutely agree. Yes, for sure. There are traditions of medicine that are tangential to or completely outside of, but that often predate by millennia, what we in a Canadian mainstream call mainstream medicine now. And they absolutely benefit health. And in a lot of cases, they have answers to questions that the other form doesn't have answers to. And I think that's actually part of this excellent question. Part of what this project is, part of a lot of the work that this project participates in is to really critically look at the rhetoric around mainstream medicine, to be critical about them, so that Western medicine can incorporate some of these practices, can acknowledge some of them. It's a really interesting space, the intersection of those things.
We are out of time. Is it a short question?
It's a short answer.
one more question,
Okay,
short
sure.
answer.
I'll give a short answer.
Sure. So
I'll just say yes.
I listened to a podcast where they compared the effects of consumption of cannabis versus the consumption of alcohol, and the general perception was that it's better to have cannabis than alcohol because they've seen a drop in the consumption of alcohol, and the side effects of alcohol are so bad that it's better to actually go for picking the less effective thing. So, given that this is all corporate, I mean, if this person is making more money, this person is making less money.
Yeah.
So, would this corporate have a counter rhetoric to ensure that like this is bad, don't have it, keep at this, because people need to have this, some drug of choice.
Something to numb the pain of the world. So the question is about the moment right now where cannabis is looking like it's not as bad for us as alcohol in research, and if the market will respond to that with some kind of
Counter.
riposte.
Yep.
That's a great question, and it just remains to be seen because alcohol is going to have to scramble. Because there was just a huge study about alcohol, and I want some wine after this talk, but there's bad news because it's just bad for you. Says this huge longitudinal study, like all these little studies that were like a glass of wine might actually be good for your health. Not really, the benefits are psychological, but what it does to your liver is terrible, and cannabis might actually be. Especially if you're taking it not in a smoking form, it might actually be, here might, because these always change around, quote unquote, better for you. And my answer is I don't know what alcohol will do, but they will probably try. Yeah, and I think that alcohol is gonna have a reckoning right now, kind of like tobacco did during the 1980s. Like they're gonna have a constriction of their market because of these studies.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you very much, Professor Madalena.
Thanks so much.